second. Recursion seconds. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Okay, the next item we have is we're going to open a hearing on House Bill 2101, extending transfers from the Expanded Lottery Act Revenue Fund to the university's engineering initiatives. And we will start out with the reviser's overview, and we'll have David Weiss. David, welcome committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Committee. House Bill 2101 would extend the current transfer of the first $10.5 million credited
Welcome to a special edition of Convention of States Live. In a few minutes, we are expecting a hearing by the Kansas Senate Ways and Means Committee on the Convention of States resolution. They are on other bills at the moment, but we're going to take you there live as soon as they get to the Convention of States resolution there in Kansas. 15 states have already passed our Article 5 resolution, and it is being considered this year by an additional 22 states, including Kansas. Convention of States Action President Mark Meckler is on the ground there in Topeka, the capital of Kansas, and he is expected to testify, so stay tuned, and that's coming up in just a few minutes. How did we get here? Well, the Convention of States Kansas team has been busy building support across the state. Over 28,000 Kansans have signed the Convention of States petition, and many are expected to be at the hearing today. And then they will hold a rally directly afterwards, so we're hoping to get some images of that. But stay tuned for that. A recent scientific survey in Kansas revealed that a whopping 2/3 of Kansas voters, that's 67% of all Kansas voters, are in favor of an Article 5 Convention of States to propose constitutional amendments that limit federal spending, limit federal power, and establish term limits for Congress and or federal judges. And that is exactly what this Kansas Legislative Committee is about to consider in just a few moments. Additionally, the platform of the Kansas Republican Party supports the calling of an Article 5 convention so that the states can reassert their constitutional power. Other prominent endorsements in Kansas include the former Kansas Senate President Susan Wagle, as well as former Lieutenant Governor Tracy Mann. So very influential heavy hitters there in Kansas have endorsed the Convention of States project. Now, we are not certain if this committee will vote today, but they are expected to vote in the coming days. So it might just be citizen testimony today, and then they'll have the vote another day. But something unusual about Kansas is that their state Constitution does impose a very high bar on Article 5 legislation. It's much higher than most states, in fact, almost every state. Instead of a simple majority to vote through Article 5 legislation, it requires a 2/3 majority in Kansas to approve anything Article 5 related through the legislature. So we have had several in the Kansas legislature before with strong majority support, but just short of that 2/3 threshold. The COS Kansas team is hoping to overcome that significant challenge in this year's session. Stay tuned after the hearing. We're hoping to have a quick recap, fact check of any opponent testimony, and we'll also try to get some live reaction from an on-the-ground reporter. No promises on that. They're very busy in Topeka today. As I said, they have a rally directly after the hearing, so there's a lot of coordination that needs to happen, but we will try to have a recap for you as well as live reaction here in just a few moments. Again, they're on other bills right now, but we will go to that committee hearing once we come up. While we're waiting for that committee to begin, in CUS news elsewhere across the country, last week in South Carolina, our Article 5 resolution passed out of committee there, the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Constitutional Law, by a vote of 3-2, and it now heads to the full Judiciary Committee for a vote. More than 60 citizen supporters packed an overflow hearing room for that. Also in Missouri, the Missouri House General Laws Committee passed a resolution that would remove the sunset clause on the Convention of States resolution. Although Missouri has already passed the Convention of States resolution, they were the 12th state to do so. That legislation does expire next year, so the vote to remove that clause was overwhelmingly positive, 11-4. And if that is passed through both chambers in Missouri, Missouri would continue to count towards the 34 states needed to call the convention. So onward, Missouri. On last Wednesday, we passed the Wisconsin Assembly Committee on the Constitution and Ethics by a vote of 5-4, and we're looking for an Assembly floor vote as early as next week. So far, 22 states have introduced the Convention of States resolution this year, and they're considering it. So Hawaii, Illinois, Iowa, Kansas, Kentucky, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Montana, Nebraska, New Hampshire, New Jersey, North Carolina, South Dakota, Vermont, Virginia, Washington, West Virginia, Wisconsin, and Wyoming are all considering Convention of States this year. 15 states have already passed our Article 5 resolution. Georgia was the first, quickly followed by Alaska, Florida, Alabama, Indiana, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Tennessee, North Dakota, Arizona, Missouri, Texas, Arkansas, Mississippi, and Utah. Very recently, we were pleased to get the endorsement of Representative Mark Meadows of North Carolina. He was official endorsement for Convention of States. He also served in the Trump administration as Trump's chief of staff. So we're very pleased to get that. Meadows represented North Carolina's 11th district from 2013 to 2020. And during his time in Congress, Representative Meadows helped found the House Freedom Caucus to fight for limited government issues, and he's been a staunch defender of liberty throughout his career. And now he's thrown his considerable influence behind Convention of States. Joe Biden and this is a quote from him. Joe Biden and Congress continue to push a leftist agenda, encouraging rule changes to force their will on the American people. It is time for state legislatures to use their constitutional leverage and pass a Convention of States resolution. It's time to rein in the power of career politicians. That's a quote from Mark Meadows, our most recent endorsement. And Mark Meckler, Convention of States president, said we couldn't be happier to have the endorsement of a champion of liberty like Representative Meadows. He has a proven track record of advocating for fiscal responsibility and limited government, whether in President Trump's White House or as a leader in Congress. His love for his country is clear, and we're excited to welcome him to the Article 5 movement. Meadows joins dozens of other national leaders, thinkers, and legal experts in endorsing Convention of States, including Mark Levin, Ben Shapiro, Sean Hannity, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, Texas Governor Greg Abbott, Senator Rand Paul, Ben Carson, and many, many others. So again, we are moments away from a Kansas committee hearing on Convention of States. They are on other bills at the moment. We will keep it here for a minute if you just stay patient with us. We do have some pictures from Convention of States President Mark Meckler there. He is in the room waiting to testify in favor of our resolution. Mark's had a busy travel schedule lately, so we appreciate your thoughts and prayers for him. And he's just been a warrior and a patriot for the cause, but he has no greater joy than to be with citizen patriots across the country in support of COS. So again, we'll keep it here, and hopefully the Kansas committee will take up Convention of States here in just a few moments.
Class that's created, the significant contributions that industry or cluster of industries makes to the state general fund, and these are primary jobs, by the way.
Of the previous administration and administrations before it. It is a crisis of a federal government that has grown far, far out of control, far outside the bounds of the Constitution as set by the founders. The founders set forth very strict limits for our federal government, and we refer to them often, as did the founders, as enumerated powers. They were limited, they were very specific. And yet, over the last 115 years approximately, mostly via Supreme Court decisions, the federal government has greatly expanded its powers to where the states have become almost mere appendages of the federal government. In this state and virtually every state across the country, it is about 60 to 65% of the budget of the state is controlled by the federal government in some way or another. And we've seen this again across administrations. The federal debt continues to spiral out of control. We just passed a $1.9 trillion spending bill. Posit a guess, and certainly I can speak for myself, that nobody in this room actually understands what $1 trillion is, what this does to our economy, what it does to our children, our grandchildren, and posterity. In fact, the founders told us imposing debt on future generations was immoral, and they were strongly opposed to it. They did it during the American Revolution, and they required that we pay it off as early as possible so as to not burden future generations with our debt. Today, our national debt stands at almost $29 trillion. This is an incredible number beyond comprehension, and we are burdening our future generations with this, our kids, our grandkids, and our posterity, and we must do something about this. Today, the American public, when polled, and polled consistently over the last 30 years, favors term limits for the United States Congress. The United States Congress will never impose term limits upon itself. They have the power to do so, to propose such an amendment. They've never done it, and they will never do it. It is against human nature. Today, roughly 80 to 85%, and this has been consistently polled for 30 years, favor some form of balanced budget amendment on the federal government. Most of the states are required to balance their budgets. The federal government is not, and this is the reason for $29 trillion in debt. And yet, the federal government will never impose a balanced budget amendment upon itself. Again, contrary to human nature, to limit your own power. Finally, today, 72% of the American public across the country, so that's a bipartisan number, say the federal government is too big and it does too many things. It's too disconnected from the American people. We may argue on a partisan basis about what should be done, what should the federal government do, what should it not do, how much money should be spent on one thing or another, but where we do not disagree as American people is we do not disagree on the idea government should do less and that those responsibilities should fall on the states. At the founding, there was a great debate between Hamilton and Jefferson, and most people are aware of this debate. Hamilton, the big government guy, Jefferson, the small government agrarian guy, and they argued about what was the proper size and scope of the government. Both of those founding fathers would be considered small government people today, and they did agree on one fundamental premise. They agreed in what they called exclusive spheres of authority. And that meant that it would be untenable, outrageous, uninhabitable for a country to possess two layers of legislative authority on the same subject. They actually believed that if the federal government could do something, had the power to do something under the Constitution, then states did not, and vice versa. They believed that if it was in the purview of a state, then the federal government should have no authority. Today, we have a multi-layered system. You have your own departments of energy and agriculture and protecting your environment. And the federal government has these things, making it impossible for the average person to navigate this quagmire of rules and regulations and laws. The question is, what do we do? We live in a very contentious time in American history. Seems like every issue is 50-50. Americans agree on almost nothing. Whoever ends up in charge of the houses and the presidency in Washington, D.C., 50% of the country approximately opposes, and vice versa. So what do we do about that? What is the cause and what do we do? I would argue, and I think this is borne out by circumstances, that the cause, the actual very cause of our strife in this country today is not politics per se, it's power. It's about a fundamental question. See, we argue about what Washington, D.C. should or should not do. What should be the policy on energy? What should be the policy on abortion? What should be the policy on education in our schools? And they love that argument in Washington, D.C. They all love it, both parties. And the reason they love it is because the underlying premise of that argument is that we should look to Washington, D.C. to tell us how to live our lives. The American people don't buy that premise. People in Kansas don't buy that premise. We've polled this nationally. Fully 2/3 of Americans nationally, this is on a state-by-state basis, say that it is time to call a convention of states and bring the power back to the states. And that's what we're asking you to do today. This particular resolution that we're asking you to vote on has 3 subject matter areas. It says that the convention may debate, 1, anything that imposes fiscal restraints on the federal government. That would include a balanced budget amendment. It would include maybe caps on taxation and spending. My favorite, it would include potentially imposing generally accepted accounting principles on the federal government. Most people don't realize this. Actually, the federal government uses no accounting principles. I've sat with officials at the Congressional Budget Office. They have no principles. They just decide how they want to account for things. So we need generally accepted accounting principles imposed. Number 2, it could discuss anything that would impose term limits on federal officials. Notice I didn't say Congress, I said federal officials, because the problem is broader. We all understand the problem nowadays of the deep state of bureaucrats who are unaccountable, unelected. And again, this is nonpartisan. These are people who get into positions of authority, who are making the rules and the regulations. They're serving as rulemaker, as judge and jury on the prosecution of regulations, and they're not accountable to the American people. They are not elected. So we can put term limits on Congress. Yes, 80 to 85% of Americans believe we should do that, but also on the bureaucrats, on staffers, and also on the judiciary. And I think all of those things are important. The third thing is anything that would impose scope, jurisdiction, or power restrictions on the federal government. This is where we get into enumerated powers. This is where we're trying to bring the power back to the states, the power back to Kansans. Kansans elect you because they trust you and they believe in you, regardless of your party. Polling shows overwhelmingly that state legislatures have favorable opinion ratings among their constituents, while Congress, they're kind of below coronavirus in their favorability ratings. It's absolutely incredible. So your constituents want you to have the power, and the founders gave you that power. They gave you an incredibly unique power. And when I say they gave you, I mean you in particular, you as state legislatures. They gave you the power to call a convention, to propose amendments, and to ratify those amendments. That actually makes you the most powerful people in the federal government. You don't learn this when you take office and you come and you get your orientation. They show you where the restrooms are, the cafeteria, maybe the legislative drafting office, the speaker's office. They don't tell you about your role in the federal government, that you have this unique power. And there's a reason they gave you that power. They gave you that power because you are them. You sit in the same the founders sat, and most of them sat in colonial legislatures, in early state legislatures, under the Articles of Confederation. They sat on county boards and county councils. And it's not that they thought that people who sat in those bodies would be better human beings, they understood human nature. It's that they understood that you would actually live among your constituents, that you would be close to your constituents, and thus more accountable to your constituents. Coming into a legislature like this, as I do every single week, reminds me of that. That I can walk into your office and I can sit down with you, that I see your constituents in your offices with you, meeting with you, that they talk about meeting with you out in the field. That's not true for congressmen and women. It's not true for United States senators. They have unique access to you, and this is what the founders understood, and this is why they gave you the power. I want to address one thing with all due respect about the 2/3 rules here in Kansas. I will tell you, generally speaking, they are unconstitutional. And the courts have ruled on this multiple times. You will hear otherwise from opponents of using Article 5. But this is the #1 treatise on the law of Article 5 written by Professor Rob Natelson. And so I want to read just a couple of quotations from this book. On page 38, it says, at the state level, legislatures and electors have often adopted state constitutional rules, legislation, and interstate compacts to manipulate the amendment procedure. Yet in a long line of cases, the courts have rejected those efforts. They are unconstitutional. By the way, the list of cases takes up half a page. It starts in 1813 is the first one, and it goes all the way to 1984 cases. So this is established law and authority. Note, this principle, ordinary legislation may not alter the amendment process. That applies at every step of the process: state legislative, application, ratification, proposal, and mode of ratification. This has been recently litigated in Missouri under Calzone versus Richard. And actually in this book, the Kansas Constitution is mentioned. It says, it follows, and this is on page 39, in the Kansas Constitution, Article 2, Section 13, requiring a 2/3 vote of each entire house to apply or ratify, it's not enforceable. And the Kansas Attorney General so ruled in an opinion, Kansas Attorney General 1910 on December 4th, 2019. You have the authority, by simple majority, to pass this resolution. To join the 15 states that have already done so. There are 49 states that have filed the application. 30 states have passed it out of committee. 23 states out of one house or another. 15 states completely. This year, expect passage in between 5 and 10 states. We are going to have a convention of states, and we are going to limit the scope, power, and jurisdiction of the federal government, and we are going to return it to you. The question that Kansans are going to be asking, and there are over 30,000 of them that have signed the petition here in Kansas, they're going to be asking, will Kansas stand and make its voice heard? Will the Kansas legislature represent the people of Kansas in saying, enough is enough with the federal government, we want to restrain their power, and we want you, the Kansas legislature, to have that power? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, I'd be happy to take questions if there are any.
Thank you very much. If we would, I'd like to have the other two conferees, and then we'll just ask questions of all conferees at that time. So the next conferee is David Snyder.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Again, my name is David Schneider. I work as a lobbyist for Convention of States Action from Manhattan, Kansas. I do this in several states. You have my written testimony. I won't take any more of time today, but I wanted to make sure that you guys knew I was a proponent for this very worthy cause and something I've been working on for about 8 years in the state of Kansas, first as a volunteer and now as a staff member for the organization. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. David Copeland. Welcome, David.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I also will be very brief, but I do stand here with behind me the 30,000 petition signers in the state of Kansas. I represent them. I am a volunteer. I've been doing this for about 6 years. They call me the state director. I manage the database. And so I know those 30,000 are out there, and I stand here for them. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, questions? Senator Hildebrand.
Mr. Chairman, I do have a few questions if you will allow, but Mark Meckler could probably answer all of my questions.
Senator?
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for your testimony. Reading through your written testimony, you said all this comes courtesy of an activist Supreme Court, which has vastly expanded federal power through its precedents. The court has created loopholes to the Constitution's limits on federal powers, and those loopholes will remain there until someone closes them. Looking at the Convention of States, nowhere in that is there a proposed amendment for judicial reform or to close that loophole on Supreme Courts. If what you're saying, that is the catalyst of all of our problems, that would seem to be one of the very first, very most important things that we look at. Why do you not look at that?
With all due respect, Senator Hildebrand, it is contained in the Convention of States application. In other words, the Convention of States application, the broadest line of it is to reduce or to address the scope, power, and jurisdiction of the federal government. Of course, the Supreme Court is the Supreme Court of the judiciary branch of the federal government and therefore is subject to limitation under that clause of our application. To give you some specific examples of that, one of the largest loopholes created by the United States Supreme Court is the interpretation of the Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause was intended to grant a very narrow authority to the federal government to regulate shipping of goods across state lines. Today, the Commerce Clause, based on Supreme Court interpretation, has given authority for the Department of Education, Energy, Commerce, the EPA, the USDA, the FDA, and an alphabet soup of agencies. All of those loopholes, that loophole, the Commerce Clause loophole, can and I would argue should be addressed in a convention of states to limit the scope, power, and jurisdiction of the federal government, and the convention would have full authority to do so. In addition, the convention would have full authority, should it choose to do so, to propose amendments to specifically not just limit the court's authority over those areas or overturn the court in those areas, but to actually do away with those institutions and to prohibit the federal government from dealing in those areas should a convention choose to make those suggestions to the states and put those out for ratification. So absolutely, all these areas where the court has created loopholes can and should be addressed by a convention of states.
Thank you. I'm not sure I disagree completely with that vague interpretation, because until you address exactly the Supreme Court, they can still make those rulings, activist rulings, and you can go back all the way to Marbury versus Madison, and that's where it all begins. My second question is, you said 60 to 65% of state budgets are federal dollars. If the federal government is indeed the main problem, don't you think states should be held accountable and hold the federal government accountable? But whenever we are using 60, 65% of that, our budget as federal dollars, wouldn't states be considered enablers to a runaway federal government?
Yeah, and I want to clarify, I did not say that the states, that 60 to 65% of state budgets are made up of federal dollars. That would be inaccurate. What I said is 60 to 65% of state budgets, generally speaking, are controlled in one way or another by federal control. So a lot of times they will control you through their regulatory authority and cause the state to have to act in certain ways based on federal regulation. So I just want to clarify that. Do I think the states are enablers? Absolutely. Would I be personally in favor of the states not taking those dollars? Personally, absolutely. However, if we want to stop the states from enabling the federal government, the founders actually gave us away, and it was Article 5. And they said that they expected that the federal government would get out of control and operate outside its boundaries. And the ultimate act of federalism provided by the founders in the United States Constitution under Article 5 is the calling of a convention. So my answer is yes, I absolutely think the state should act, and this is the methodology that the founders gave us to act against an out-of-control federal government.
Again, I disagree a little bit on your premise, but I think the states, as being enablers, need to be corrected first, because you've got to correct the problem before you correct the solution. You mentioned going against the state constitution. So here you are as a member of the COS advocating for less federal control, more state control. But now you're saying, let's go with the federal control on this because we want this COS to pass. So we think your constitution violates the federal constitution. Nowhere in Article 5 does it dictate to states how they will pass an Article 5 resolution. It says it's delegated up to the legislature. The legislature passes laws. In order for that statute or for that constitutional amendment to pass, or that provision in our Constitution under Article 2, it had to come through the legislature. So the legislature did play a role. If this legislature wants to reverse that, there's a process for that. We can do that. That has never been tried. So it's for someone advocating federal government's the boogeyman and the state government is the savior. Why are we not trying at the state level first and then saying, oops, in this case, we're going to side with the federal government because they have all the power?
With all due respect, Senator Hildebrand, you are mischaracterizing my position. I'm not advocating the states against the federal government or the federal government against the states. I'm advocating for the United States Constitution. I stand here and say we should live by, and we should support, and we should utilize the tools given to us by the United States Constitution. As a constitutional attorney, I have a fundamental understanding of the United States Constitution, both its boundaries and limitations and its powers. Within the United States Constitution is the Supremacy Clause. Well settled. There's no court that disagrees with this. There's no state legislature that disagrees with this. In fact, it would be constitutional malpractice for an attorney to disagree with this, which is that the United States Constitution is supreme as to the matters it speaks upon. And in this case, it sets forth the way that an Article 5 convention works. So you and I are in fundamental disagreement on that, and maybe that'll be litigated at some point, but I can tell you the courts have spoken on this. I read the case. I could go through the list of cases that speak to this very issue, and there are cases dating back, I believe, into the 1800s, as late as the 1980s. And so we just have a disagreement on that point of law.
Let's address your court case of Selman versus Richard. That wasn't a victory, right?
I'm not familiar with the case that you're citing.
It's the one in Missouri that you cited last night, that it was a victory for the COS.
It was a victory. It did not allow the state to change the rules. That there was a litigant who litigated saying that we had to follow state rules in regard to that case, or in regard to Calzone. You're talking about the Calzone case?
Correct. That was dismissed on a technicality because Calzone didn't have.
That's correct. So that is a victory. I mean, obviously, you don't. The way a litigation works is if a case is dismissed, the person who didn't have the case dismissed is victorious.
Okay, so if the case would have been vice versa and it was dismissed, you would call that a victory as well, because the judge ruled that the person didn't have standing to bring that case. That is why it was dismissed, not on the grounds or the terms of the case, but on the person did not have standing. To me, that's not a victory. That's a technicality.
I understand that you're saying that, Senator, but as a lawyer, a licensed lawyer since 1988, I'm just going to tell you on a legal basis, you're not correct.
Okay. Well, you count victories a lot different than I do. So thank you.
Are there any other questions? Yes, Senator Dietrich. I saw her first.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify something. You said you talk fast.
I'm sorry, Senator.
That's okay.
I apologize.
That's okay. So I wrote down when you were talking about the question, when you were answering Senator Hildebrand about the Supreme Court, you said do away with institutions. You were talking about the Commerce Clause. What institutions are you talking about?
Sure. So specifically, there are multiple agencies, administrative agencies of the federal government that have been set up under the auspices of Commerce Clause authority, greatly expanded authority granted to the federal government by the United States Supreme Court under a line of cases beginning with Wickard v. Filburn. I believe that was 1931. And these agencies have no constitutional basis for their existence according to the Constitution. I'll give you a very specific example, Senator. The Department of Education is not authorized under the Constitution. And I've argued this with a lot of people, and all we have to do is look back to Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson has a series of letters between he and one of his closest friends, William Henry Lee. Jefferson was a great proponent of public education, perhaps the greatest among the founding fathers. He believed we needed an educated electorate. When he was founding University of Virginia, Henry Lee suggested that he get federal money for University of Virginia. And Jefferson wrote back and said, well, that's unconstitutional. And essentially, we would need an education amendment before we could do that. Of course, he was there among the founders. There has never been an education amendment. The reason that we have a Department of Education, or that we are allowed to, that authority exists, is because the Supreme has broadly interpreted the Commerce Clause to allow that.
So Besides education, may I ask what other things or what are other agencies you believe have been expanded?
Sure. So we can look at a lot of the alphabet soup of agencies. So for example, there's no constitutional authority for the Environmental Protection Agency. And the states all do a fantastic job of that in my travels across the country. I've been in 48 state legislatures. Federal government doesn't have authority for that. The federal government doesn't have authority over agriculture within state lines. So that you could go through, and it's roughly, I'm roughing this because it's hard to say exactly, but roughly 40% of federal agencies exist under what is called Commerce Clause authority. And that's the authority that would be cited when those agencies were created.
Yeah, I'll just ask one more follow-up. I'm sorry, I don't mean to take too much time here. So if you were to dissolve those agencies because they don't have the constitutional right to exist, do you not see some disruption to our everyday lives and the way we regulate agriculture, education, the environment? Or is that something that you don't want us to do? You don't want us to regulate?
No, I do believe we need to regulate to some extent those things, but I'm a big fan of state-based regulation, that people who understand agriculture in Kansas regulate agriculture in Kansas, as opposed to that coming out of the Department of Agriculture. Much of our tax base, for example, for agriculture, it goes to Washington, D.C., and then the money comes back to Kansas after it goes to Washington, D.C. I believe that money should stay in Kansas, should be decided and regulated by Kansas. So would it create some disruption? The answer would be, it depends on how we did it. Most of these things, I believe what a convention would do is they would have a time period before those agencies are phased out. They would have a twilight period. I don't think anybody who's at convention would just say, we should just shut down that agency tomorrow and create chaos. Because I agree with you, these agencies are deeply embedded into American life, and it would take time for the states to take over these functions and the funds that go with those functions.
Thank you.
Senator Ware.
Now I'll have the mic. You know, the idea of term limits, not too bad. Balanced budget might be painful, but a reasonable thing to do. The third point, though, that you have about the government just being too big is where I have some concerns. For instance, it sounds to me, in my reading about Convention of States, is that we don't really know how we would choose the delegates that would be making these incredibly, monumentally huge, never almost been decided before, you know, 1776, ideas and putting them in place. We don't know how those delegates would be chosen. We really aren't sure at all because nothing is settled about what procedure they would take. I mean, we don't know if these would be elected folks, and we're not sure how they would be managing it. And there is so much at stake here that we could completely upend. I mean, you say that we're limiting, but saying too big a government really means anything, right? I mean, it does. We could lose the Bill of Rights. We could certainly lose any of the programs that millions of Americans depend on, Medicare, Social Security, you know, any number of things as every aspect of our lives. So how can, I'm terribly uncomfortable with just saying, yeah, okay, that we can go on, well, I believe it would be like this, or I believe it would be like that. That's way too vague, seems to me.
A question, Senator? That was a commentary.
What would
I appreciate your comments.
right? Well, what is your response to that? Am I right?
No, fundamentally, with all due respect, Senator, at every level of what you said, you're incorrect. I mean, you did express opinions, and I appreciate your opinions. Those opinions are expressed, I would argue, out of two places. One is fear, and one is lack of knowledge. And my request would be that you read the law of Article 5, because everything you talked about does exist. And we have a long history in this country. There's an entire treatise been written about it. We have an over 200-page legislative compendium on our website that contains answers to all the questions that you asked. So I don't mean it in any way as an insult on lack of knowledge. There's a lot of things I don't know about because I haven't read about them enough to know. And so, for example, let's talk about how you choose the delegates. I'll get into some of the specifics. We don't know in the sense because that's called federalism. And all of us live in and believe in and actually swear an oath to a constitution that enforces a system of federalism. Kansas, the Kansas legislature, you here in the legislature would decide how you choose your delegates. And that doesn't scare me from my perspective. I think that's fantastic. I want the states to exercise all the power that they have under the United States Constitution. So we don't know because the Constitution leaves that to the states. When those delegates go to convention, we do know the limits on their power. We know because 34 states are required to pass the same resolution and agree in advance what that resolution says, what the decision will be like at convention. Generally speaking, we do know what the rules will be at convention. We don't know exactly, and I'll definitely give you that. However, in American history, and this is something people are generally very confused about, they think that there's never been a convention, we don't know anything about conventions. There's a long history of conventions across American history, 11 conventions before 1787, over 30 since the 1787 Constitutional Convention. They've operated under almost an identical set of rules. The rules are summarized in here. You can read them if you like. The courts have ruled on this issue on issues around Article 5 over 40 times. Again, you could read that all in here. And they've always said that the rules of a convention are based in precedent and history. We have a long precedent in history. In American history, for example, it has always been one state, one vote throughout American history in every convention. There was one convention where they did try to change that. That's the Washington Peace Convention, just prior to the Civil War. And the states did vote. And the states with a bigger population, of course, wanted more power in that convention, and they voted one state, one vote to keep it one state, one vote. It is also called a convention of states for a reason. We know it's one state, one vote. These are sovereign states participating. It's not a convention of delegates or populations. You mentioned the Bill of Rights. Important to understand the Bill of Rights cannot come under attack in this convention. If you read the plain language of the application itself, it would not apply to the Bill of Rights. We brought in legal scholars from across the spectrum, dozens of legal scholars, to make sure that that could not be done. So that's not Mark Meckler's opinion. You could look at our legal board of reference, Robbie George from Princeton, Randy Barnett from Georgetown, John Eastman from Chapman, Professor Rob Nadelson, the premier expert on Article 5 in the country. These are people who spent their entire lives doing nothing but studying the Constitution, and they disagree with your conclusion that these people could just look at anything they want. And I would encourage you, get a copy of Law of Article 5, and I'd be happy to continue this discussion.
Mr. Mark, thank you. Are there any other questions for the proponents? We do appreciate that
Thank you, Mr.
question.
Chairman.
Thank you very
Members
much.
of the committee.
We do have the opponents. I will say that we do have written proponents. We have, I think this is a record for, while I've been here, 22 proponents. And they are in your packets, so take a look at those. So we'll go to the opponents. And John Axtell, Kansas Campaign for Liberty. John, welcome to committee.
Honorable Chairman Alley and members of the Senate Federal and State Affairs Committee, I'm John Axtell. I'm from Wichita, and I'm a volunteer coordinator with Kansas Campaign for Liberty. The Constitution is already very powerfully and clearly written to truly limit the federal government. And if it were enforced, it would certainly do that job. This resolution assumes, on the other hand, that there's a problem with the words in the current Constitution, that they're deficient in some way. But that assertion or assumption could not be further from the truth. Let's look at the problem, which is the fact that we don't enforce the Constitution. And let's look at an example of that. Let's look at our huge debt, which is caused by our fiat currency. It's caused by our fiat currency in two ways. One is cheap money encourages borrowing by lowering interest rates, and cheap money also causes inflation, meaning you can't buy as much stuff in the future as you can spending that currency today. We all know about that. Our fiat currency causes debt, and it is a currency that's not backed by gold or silver, and that's in brazen violation of Article 1, Section 10 of the U.S. Constitution, which states that nothing but gold and silver shall be legal tender. We allow fiat currency to exist. We allow this violation of the Constitution, and therefore we have our debt. It's as simple as that. And this is just one example of the many ways in which the Constitution is not enforced or followed with serious consequence. Next, implicit in this resolution is the idea that once these resolutions are passed, the desired amendments are ratified and so on, we've had a convention and everything, that we can all relax and these words, the new words, will somehow enforce themselves. You know, I'm a conservative and I make fun of gun-free signs because gun-free signs are impotent at enforcing themselves. Words and symbols don't do that. If we want words in the Constitution that truly limit the power of federal government, it's our job to enforce those. There is no paid professional law enforcement team like there is for all the statutes and ordinances and even the rules created by bureaucrats. Those are enforced by paid professionals. We are the people that enforce the provisions that truly limit our federal government. And if we don't do that job, it doesn't get done. No words exist with that power to self-enforce. Third, if we look at the political landscape in this country, there's no chance of gathering together 38 states in support of decreasing the power of the federal government. And on the other hand, Kansas is arguably one of the 5 or 10 most conservative states in this country. So 38 or even more states, all less conservative, could easily join together and totally ignore the will of the people in this state, having a constitutional convention and ratifying amendments that could destroy our liberties and certainly would leave out Kansas. Lastly, in January, legislators solemnly swore to support the Kansas Constitution, finishing their oath by saying, "So help me God." Yet leaders in the effort to pass this resolution, including some of the legislators, had planned to pass rules allowing, quote unquote, passage of this resolution with a simple majority, in clear and direct violation of Article 2, Section 13 of the Kansas Constitution, which legislators swore to support and which requires a 2/3 supermajority. Now, I hear proponents complaining about the Supreme Court rulings as rogue or as not really acknowledging or respecting the Constitution. And yet they cite court rulings from that very same Supreme Court in justifying the opinion delivered by the Attorney General, which I have here. And I think the most important thing about this opinion is that it was written with the question in mind of this: will the federal government, which is the problem, allow a violation of the will of the people of Kansas, which they are not the problem, in order to fix the federal government, which is the problem? And whether he meant to or not, the Attorney General gave revealing testimony to the fact that this is not a matter of empowering the state of Kansas and bringing down the U.S. federal government. This is something exactly the opposite when he said that this process, and this is a direct quote, cannot be constrained by the people of Kansas, end quote. This process cannot be constrained by the people of Kansas. These leaders, these legislators swore under God to support the Kansas Constitution, and yet they plan to violate their solemn oath, giving us proof that this convention will not be governed by rules, procedures, or principles. Words need to be added to the Constitution when the words that are there are wrong, such as regarding slavery, regarding the lack of women's suffrage, 18-year-olds in the 1970s going off to war, being conscripted into war and not being able to vote about it. Those are places where words need to be changed. But when the words themselves suffice, if enforced, suffice to constrain the federal government as desired by the proponents and by myself, when the words exist and they suffice to do that job, there is no need for changing those words. There is a need to enforce the Constitution. I urge you to vote against SCR 1611, and I stand for questions.
Thank you, John. Are there questions? Senator Faust-Goodell.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm not sure if this is totally directed to everything, but I'm serious. I felt I was in Congress listening to you. I felt like we were in a higher supreme building or committee. So you mentioned that we here in Kansas legislators, we swear in and take our oath, but we usually do that at the beginning of our 4-year session. Do you think that we should be required to do that oath at the beginning prior to each legislative session or not? Or do you have an opinion?
Well, that's a good question. I believe that your oath to fidelity to the Constitution and to the Kansas Constitution is like, if I may, it's like prayer. Daily. Not that you should have to publicly recite it, but I think that's something to meditate on, right? On a daily basis. And certainly to contemplate whether you measure your oath to the Constitution and what you're doing here against the Constitution, right? Okay, so that's a daily thing to me. I don't know how to say it any better, and I hope that answered your question, but thank you, Senator.
Yes. Senator Hildebrand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, John, for your testimony. Regardless if you're for Article 5 or Convention of States or not, I'd say everybody that's part of the Article 5 movement, Convention of States, are patriots, and they genuinely want a solution. They see that as a solution. That is a solution that's brought to them. That's why it's so popular. What, if that is not the solution, what is the solution?
Thank you for bringing that question, because I have a great deal of respect for the patriotism of the proponents. And so I wanted to be clear on that. This is not a debate with their personal character or anything like that. But the solution to this problem is local and state activation right here in Kansas that would empower our local teams and our state to act in ways that would actually be more constitutional, okay? Such as talking about the way funding is received from the federal government and then spent, for example. But we need to organize. We need to draw people together on the basis of constitutional principles to do things like, well, Campaign for Liberty in Kansas here is working to pass the Kansas Legal Tender Act, which I've talked about the fiat currency already. And the Kansas Legal Tender Act would restore gold and silver to the proper status, the constitutionally required status, by the way, of legal tender. And gold and silver have the special properties, like I've talked about, of being real money. And they're very, very important in empowering the poor and the lower middle class once again. They've been left behind in our fiat currency world, and so on. At the federal level, we're doing other things in Campaign for Liberty, but the state group wants to also end the highest sales tax on food, or one of the highest sales taxes on food in the country. We have several programs like that and things that we'd love to do, and I can go into a great deal of detail about the kind of organized effort we're trying to accomplish. But I think I may have answered your question. I'm not sure. Did that help?
I just wanted to hear your perspective on what it was, so thank you.
Yeah, we do need to
Other
organize
questions?
locally.
Any other questions? Thank you, John, for coming today. Appreciate
Thank you
your
very much.
testimony.
Appreciate it.
The next two are remote. The first one we have is Judy Collier from the Citizens Against Article 5. And Judy, are you online? Judy?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
We can.
Can you see
Proceed.
me?
Yes, we got you.
Whoops.
Had you. There we
I
go.
can't work. You can hear me, right? I can't work
Yes.
the video. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, there I am. Thank you very much for inviting me here with testimony. I don't think you have to be a constitutional attorney to understand the Constitution. And this is just aside from my prepared, what I was going to say. But Article 5 gives Congress a lot of power. What they give to the state legislatures is the power to ask Congress for a convention. It is very clear, which should mean that the state can decide how to ask Congress by what vote. But the legislatures do not propose amendments. They do not call the convention. Congress does that. And by Article 1, Section 8, the necessary and proper clause at the end, Congress sets the rules for the convention. And that includes delegate selection and how it's done. So the states don't necessarily get to do even that. And then as far as the ratification process goes, Congress decides which ratification process and if the states' legislatures do that. But I wanted to say that if you think you'll be voting on an application for Congress to call a limited convention, you're mistaken. Proponents don't believe their own false narrative, which is that 34 states need to pass the same or similar applications to trigger a convention, and that the resulting convention would be limited to the subject of the applications so that a runaway convention would be prevented. That just isn't true. Nothing in Article 5 says anything like that. So the scholars of the convention lobby, including Rob Nadelson, what they're doing is they're doing these aggregation studies, and they are using centuries-old applications to aggregate with these subjects, which are the BAIT, the Balanced Budget Amendment, the term limits, limiting the federal government. They are looking for, I call them wildcard applications. They're using old applications, centuries-old applications that apply to like the direct election of senators, which came out of Oregon in 1901, 1861 applications to avert the Civil War. New York had a application to get a Bill of Rights in 1789. And then there's these unlimited applications on no subject at all, just asking for a convention. These are being aggregated by scholars. Congress does the aggregating, but these are what they're going to go to Congress with to tell them that we have enough applications right now to call a convention. Strategists are testing the waters to see if they can get away right now, and with Georgia being their 34th state, to pass an application. They have a BBA application there, and they've passed right now in 27 states, but they're skipping the rest of them because they have 6, I call them wild card states, to add, like from the Civil War. The American Constitution Convention, which has board members that have backgrounds in the Convention of States and the BBA, their scholars are mixing and matching things and coming out with 37 applications already instead of the 34. And that includes Convention of States applications. US term limits has 4 applications that they got passed by states in the last 5 years, yet their website reveals that they're counting 28 states because they include all of the applications that the Convention of States has passed because they have term limits in it. And then they add 13 wildcard states to that, and they are from the Civil War, et cetera. And so why are the proponents playing with the numbers like this? Well, we don't have to guess, because their strategists have written about it. The lobbying groups have plateaued, they say. The legislators have had their fill of this issue. More states are likely to rescind applications, and their scholars are concerned that a limited convention, if called by Congress, might be declared unconstitutional by an originalist Supreme Court. They say timing is everything. The public is outraged at the corruption and dysfunction in DC. And they say that proponents need to grab whatever applications they have now, quote, a bird in the hand, and demand that Congress call a convention right now. And if that else, they say, they'll recruit state attorney generals to sue Congress for an unlimited convention. Yes, an unlimited convention. And why not? Because there's no such thing as a limited convention under Article 5 or in the US Constitution. They can use our talking points from the opponents to go to court to do this, because we're all now saying the same thing, except the lobbyists who go to the legislatures because they want your vote. Congress can aggregate applications however they wish, and delegates to an Article 5 convention cannot be limited by the subject of the application, by delegate laws, or anything. They have more power than state legislators. So they could dissolve state legislatures and Congress. It's apparent that state legislatures are being a sideshow to build momentum so they can convince Congress and the media that the people are demanding a convention when they have no idea the dangers. And that's the way those polls work. They ask about term limits, they ask about debate, the subjects, sure, people want them, but they don't know anything about the dangers of an Article 5 convention, and that cannot be done in a 3-minute robocall. This is a public relations campaign. The applications are already in. They don't need stacks of applications. Each state counts only once toward the 34. Kansas is already in. You already have 4 applications there, and they're being counted right now. The ones that I forgot what, I think there may be one on the direct election senators. Definitely your BBA is being aggregated by proponents with things from the Civil War and the Bill of Rights. The easiest way to get a new constitution, short of a hostile takeover, is through an Article 5 convention. It was not meant to rein in an out-of-control government. It was meant for defects in the Constitution. This is a convention that Madison, Hamilton, and John Jay warned about, this second convention, an Article 5 convention. They do not believe their own talking points. Why should we? Please vote no on SCR 1611.
Thank you, Judy. Are there any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for being here today. We appreciate that. Our next opponent is Mr. William Rich. And you're remote. Mr. Rich, are you online?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
We can.
Wonderful. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Bill Rich, and I'm an emeritus professor of constitutional law at Washburn University. This morning, I want to briefly emphasize 2 points to supplement my written testimony. First, I find it difficult to understand why people would believe that now is the time to hold a constitutional convention aimed at undermining the role of the national government. After a year of the COVID pandemic, we all understand the impossibility of predicting challenges we may face in the century to come. Can we predict what the future holds in terms of protection from cyber terrorism or coping with dramatic climate change? What will it take to compete with China in the world of international finance? And what problems will we face as a nation that we cannot even imagine today? The great strength of the United States Constitution has been its open texture, and here I disagree with some of what was said previously. This permits change over time to meet problems that we could not have imagined in 1787. And I mean, the Commerce Clause is a perfect example of this. For example, the Commerce Clause is what gave authority to the national government to address civil rights. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was based upon the Commerce Clause authority of Congress. Do we want to say that the national government should not be allowed to address civil rights in this nation? That's the kind of topic that would have to be addressed in the Constitutional Convention that's being discussed. The resolution before this committee was simply undermine the strength of our national government. And my second point is procedural. It relates to the 2/3 vote issue that others have already talked about. And as noted, current rules require 2/3 vote in order to adopt this resolution. Last year, however, the Kansas Attorney General issued an opinion that Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution limits enforcement of the Kansas constitutional provision that state recommendations of constitutional amendments or conventions must have a 2/3 support from the legislature. While I strongly disagree with the Attorney General's constitutional analysis, which in my view has been thoroughly discredited by one of the nation's top constitutional scholars, Professor David Super, this morning I want to emphasize a more fundamental point focused on what the Attorney General's opinion actually said. The Attorney General conceded that the Kansas legislature may adopt a 2/3 vote requirement before advancing a constitutional convention resolution. In other words, you remain free to impose that requirement on yourselves. A simple majority vote would remain contrary to the text of the Kansas Constitution. Technical questions about enforcing that provision do not change your moral obligation to uphold provisions of the Kansas Constitution, which was, if anything, strengthened by the opinion of the Attorney General when he affirmed the validity of a self-imposed 2/3 vote requirement. I close by encouraging all of you to remain faithful to your oath of office when you establish the procedure for considering this resolution, if that issue should arise. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify this morning. I'll remain available for questions if you have them.
Thank you, Mr. Rich. Are there any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony this morning.
You're very welcome.
I want to call your attention to the, I think we have 5 people that have sent in written opposition, and there was no neutral testimony given. So if there's nothing more to be brought before the committee, this committee is adjourned. Thank you very much for your testimony.
Well, we just watched the Kansas Senate Federal and State Affairs Committee for the Convention of States resolution. It was really powerful. It was a really powerful testimony that Mark Meckler did. And here's Rita. Rita, how are you doing?
Hey, Andrew, good to be with you for this special edition. And yes, that was a fascinating committee hearing there in the Kansas Senate Federal and State Affairs Committee. Fascinating. What were your thoughts?
Well, obviously, Mark Meckler is just so eloquent when it comes to explaining Article 5, the process, and how this is a safe measure to really rein in the federal government. So I always love hearing his testimony. And I do also love hearing his his great, his ability to kind of rebuke some of the questions that are a little outlandish and that are basically myths when it comes to the Article 5 process. Well, what about you? What was your favorite part?
Well, Mark is always the favorite part, of course. He's just so good at what he does. I liked how he sort of led into his testimony. He said, we have a crisis in this country today, and it's the crisis of a federal government that has grown far out of control. And that describes it so well. He pointed out that under the Constitution, our federal government was always meant to be one of specifically enumerated powers only. And clearly that's not what we have today. If you read any newspaper, you can look at all the things Washington, D.C. does that it was never given the power to do under our Constitution. And he also pointed out, Andrew, that while Americans today agree on almost nothing, polling across the country consistently indicates that 2/3 of voters, and that's across party lines, Andrew, 2/3 of voters agree that America needs this Convention of States to propose amendments to rein in our out of control federal government.
Yeah, I agree with that too, that there is wide consensus across party lines to rein in the federal government. And one of the things that stuck out to me was from Senator Ware, I believe that's how you pronounce her name. She talked about being concerned that we won't know how the delegates are chosen for the convention, and how that should be a concern for us, and basically putting a cloud or a dark mist over the particulars or the process of the Article 5 convention. And I loved how Mark he came in and was like, well, this is federalism. I want Kansas to be able to choose their delegates. I want every state to be able to choose their delegates. That's the process the founders would want. So I loved that he was able to bring that up, because it seems society right now, there seems to be this concern about federalism. Like there should be some fear of federalism, when it should be the other way. People should fear the encroachments of the federal government, not the state governments. What did you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely right. The best policy, the policy that is best for the people, is always the policy that's made closest to home by the governments that are most responsive to the people. That's why the founders put the bulk of policy making in the hands of our state governments and not the centralized national government. You know, you pointed out that Senator Ware sort of acted like a convention of the states under Article 5 would be some big free-for-all, and nobody really knows how it would work or what would happen. And, you know, that's so frustrating, Andrew, to hear that over and over again. Just because the entire process and all of its details are not spelled out in the text of Article 5, that doesn't mean we don't know how it would work. It's just like terms like grand jury are used in the Constitution, and it doesn't spell out all of the details and procedures, but we know how it would work from history, because an interstate convention, conventions of the states, were something that were very familiar to the founding fathers, and all of the major processes and procedures were the same. For instance, voting at a convention of the states or an interstate convention has always been done on the basis of one state, one vote. There's always a limited agenda that the states set before they send their commissioners to the convention. So I just get so frustrated, Andrew, by hearing these same debunked claims repeated over and over again. Do you have that experience?
Oh, absolutely. I get so frustrated at what you just said about not having the historical record to look at, because it's right there. And there's also the 200-page treatise by Professor Robert Nadelson, which outlines exactly the history of conventions and how it could work. And it's very thorough. And so the historical record is very clear, and it's there for anybody to look at. I think what's really frustrating to me too is just the mischaracterization of Article 5 as if it's not really part of the Constitution. I think that's what really frustrates me the most, because people will say, well, we need to just follow the Constitution. We need to safeguard the Constitution, protect it. Well, Article 5 is within the Constitution. The founders gave us Article 5 because they knew that we might be in a place like this, where we need to use the states to get together to propose amendments. So I don't understand why people are so quick to criticize Article 5, but then want to protect the Constitution, don't want to criticize that part of the Constitution. This doesn't make any sense to me. And then the other part that gets so frustrating for me too is calling it a constitutional convention. I mean, that just drives me bonkers, because it is not a constitutional convention. It is a convention for proposing amendments. So we're not trying to rewrite the Constitution. We're not trying to completely rip it up to shreds and start from scratch. That's not what we're attempting to do at all. And there is no authority given to us in Article 5 to do that. And so that just drives me crazy when people call it a constitutional convention or a con.
I totally agree. And to your first point, Andrew, I found it really interesting. I assume the chair was correct when he called on one of the opponents to testify, and he said that she was representing citizens against Article 5. So it's so funny because, like you said, these opponents act like their goal in life is to protect the Constitution, and yet the name of their group is against Article 5. Well, Article 5 is part of the Constitution. I wanted to point to Representative Hildebrand is a Republican member of this committee, and he seemed pretty adamant in opposition against the resolution. But I thought it was strange how one of the things he expressed was his concern that, the cause for the trouble we're in is activist Supreme Court rulings. And so he was sort of implying that with the Supreme Court issuing these activist opinions that effectively change how the Constitution is interpreted, if that's the problem, then this Article 5 convention isn't going to help. But his conclusion is completely incorrect. It doesn't go with the premise, because I would agree that an activist Supreme Court is in large measure the cause of the trouble we have today with wrong interpretations of the Constitution. But the only way to reverse those bad Supreme Court rulings is through an Article 5 convention. And, the 11th Amendment is a great example of an amendment that did just that. It reversed a bad Supreme Court decision and set things right and fixed the balance of power. So his argument didn't make much sense to me. If you're just joining us on this special edition of Facebook Live, we are reporting on a committee hearing that was just completed in the Kansas Senate Federal and State Affairs Committee, and the committee did not vote today. They were not really expected to vote today, but we expect that vote to be coming up in the near future. And in case you missed it, the West Virginia Senate Judiciary Committee voted yesterday afternoon with very little fanfare on a voice vote to recommend passage of the Convention of States resolution by the full Senate. So you are up to date. Anything else you want to comment on today, Andrew?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things that I'd like to comment on. This is the moment, I think, where talking about kind of frustrations, where it seems that there is just this need to get things done, to have urgency in addressing the issues that we are seeing within the federal government. And so part of that frustration in this hearing is that you have people saying, oh, well, we need to get things done, but then the solution doesn't get adopted. And that just drives me up a wall, knowing that the solution is right there and it was given to us for a situation just like this. But people seem very almost fearful in using that solution. I wish there was some way that we can just really reinforce that this is a safe, peaceful measure that we can use to rewrite basically a century's worth of bad policies from the federal government. What do you think is the best way that we can come at this to help bridge those fears and get those people to our side on an Article 5 Convention of States?
I think the only way we're going to do it, Andrew, is just to encourage more and more of our fellow citizens to speak out until our voices just become so loud and so clear and yet respectful, because here at Convention of States, we believe strongly in being kind, courteous, and respectful, but we're going to come on strong with our belief that this is the right thing for the country right now. It is our last best hope to restore the federal system that is designed and created by the Constitution. And that is the system that serves the people best. So I think we just need to encourage everyone watching to make sure they are speaking out, talking to their friends and family. If you haven't signed our petition yet, please make sure you do so at conventionofstates.com. Then share the petition and tell others about the Convention of States effort, so we can stop the, wringing of the hands and the shaking of the head and the pessimism and complaining. Let's be part of the solution and let's take our country back. I thought it was interesting. The chair of the committee today in the Kansas Senate mentioned that they had 22 written testimonies from proponents of Convention of States. And he said he thinks that is a record for this committee.
That's amazing.
It is just so encouraging and inspiring. We can do it. We are well on the way there. We've already passed our resolution completely in 15 states. And it seems like there's a race on right now in the country to see which state will be number 16. Will it be West Virginia? Will it be Wisconsin? Will it be South Carolina? Or will it be Kansas? Let's see.
Yeah, I'm excited to see what number 16 or which state is going to be number 16. I hope Kansas stays positive. And I think we should just give a mention to the grassroots there, because the Kansas team is absolutely amazing. And they just keep pushing the ball further and further down the court. They're getting closer and closer, and they just don't give up. They are so driven and so motivated to take our country back, to take it back from the federal government, who has inserted themselves deep into our lives. And so thank you for all that you do there in Kansas, the grassroots on the ground. It's just absolutely amazing to see all of them working tirelessly for liberty. So are we going to wrap up this recap then, Rita?
I think it's time to wrap up. And just to summarize, for those who had to join us late, we just watched a committee hearing at the Kansas Senate Federal and State Affairs Committee. We heard some public testimony, including our very own Convention of States co-founder and president, Mark Meckler, who gave excellent testimony, did an excellent job fielding questions from the committee members. The race is on, y'all, and I hope everyone watching will get involved and go to our website, sign our petition at conventionofstates.com, share it with your friends and family, and please join your Convention of States team wherever you are. We have volunteer teams in all 50 states, and we need you to get involved for the sake of our country's future.
All right, you heard her. You get involved. If you want to make a difference, you need to get involved, join your local team, and also make sure that you follow us on social media as well. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Well, you're already following us on Facebook, but Parler, MeWe, Gab, anywhere you get your social media buzz, and like and share all of the content that you see there. Thank you for joining us on this special edition of COS